for many people, certainly of my generation, maybe even of yours, the authoritative, canonical version of the Exodus was made by Cecil B. DeMille. And it's the crossing of the sea says it all.
Indeed.
Now, when we actually get to this in chapters 14 and 15, it gets a little bit confusing.
It does.
And there's some mixture of accounts already in chapter 14. And then we have this poem in chapter 15.
That's right.
And it does say Pharaoh and the elite of his officers were submerged in the Red Sea or the Yam Suf. Now, the Yam Suf, if indeed it is the Red Sea, that's a rather large body of water.
It is.
Would anybody in their right mind have been trying to cross it in the first case?
Well, I think we probably should start by accepting that the Yam Suf is almost certainly not the Red Sea. Suf doesn't, Yam means sea. Suf does not mean red. Right? Suf means reeds. It's the sea of reeds.
Actually, there is a nice usage of that in the book of Jonah, in a psalm too, that seems a little bit of a foreign body in the book, but when he's sinking in the water, he talks about being entangled in the suf.
That's right.
And the suf is the stuff that grows in the bottom of the
That's right.
Yeah.
It certainly means sea of reeds. The question then is, what body of water is that describing?
Yeah.
It's possible that it could be something like the Red Sea, although, you know, a sea of reeds you would expect to be something somewhat more shallow.
Yeah, but I think it is used for the Red Sea, at least some of the time later on. It is to judge from the locations where it's used. But it's it's certainly not used exclusively for the Red Sea.
Right. So, I mean, what's interesting is actually in Exodus 14 itself, it never says Red Sea. Right, just talks about the sea or the waters. And in Exodus 15, it says Yam Suf. But again...
Yeah. Now, what are we to make of this poem in Exodus 15? A lot of people think that this is one of the oldest poems in the Hebrew Bible. That's because of the kind of language, parallels in Ugaritic and whatnot. But now, if you were to read this chapter, if you read the hymn or it is a hymn in praise of God. But if you're trying to extrapolate from that what actually happened, what would you think happened?
You would think that God picked up Pharaoh and his army and dropped them into the water and that they sank like a stone and there they died.
Yeah. But what's conspicuously lacking in it is anybody crossing
the water.
Right.
That's right.
So, they could be going along on a cliff and big wind comes and blows them in, or they could be on boats and capsized, but it's sinking in water.
Conspicuously absent from the poem, at least that part of the poem that describes the death of Pharaoh in the water, is the Israelites entirely.
Indeed.
Right? This is not a question of pursuit or conflict. This is God versus Pharaoh. The Israelites are simply not present. It's only later in the poem, it's what feels like a odd extension of the narrative, where God leads the Israelites to his holy mountain.
Indeed.
Which is not really fit with the story, at least at this point in the book of Exodus. It's looking a little further ahead.
It's getting ahead of itself, and a lot of people would think that there is actually a second hand here, an extension of this poem in chapter 15. And the whole poem, by the time you're getting in and settled on the mountain of your inheritance, that can't be as old as some people think the early part of the chapter is.
I think it's certainly a point worth wondering about.
But now what the question for us at the moment is this really a poem about the Exodus at all?
All it has is God versus Pharaoh and a battle at the sea. Neither of those themes is unique to the Exodus story.
Right, yeah.
I mean, maybe you would like to say more about what kinds of hymns these sorts of things are.
Well, now, what this one always reminds me of is, I think it's Psalm 69, where somebody is praying to the Lord and talks about sinking in the waters and the floods coming over his head. And it turns out, when you read on in the psalm, that he wasn't even wet. You know, he was complaining that people hated him without cause or something. So it's a way of expressing distress. So I would take it that all you could really infer from Exodus 15 is that Pharaoh suffered some defeat, at least from the perspective of people who worshipped Yahweh.
Now, is the Exodus the only defeat that Pharaoh could have suffered? Is it the
Surely
only possible
not.
reference?
Surely not. You know, the Egyptians had been in control of what we call Canaan, the land where Israel is, for a long time. At any point when they made an incursion in there, they continued to make incursions in there in the time of Solomon and later. So any Egyptian defeat would do.
No matter how minor, even a very minor one would have been worthy
but
of
it
song.
gives you a nice hymn, and it fits rather nicely here as a celebration of the Exodus.
That's right.
Whether it was originally composed for that
Right. I mean,
at all.
the person or persons who inserted this poem in this place chose well.
Yeah.
We can certainly say that.
And in fact, then you have a little bit after that, Miriam gets in on the act.
That's right.
And she starts to strike up, but she seems to be lacking originality because it sounds very much like what Moses
So
just said.
Moses sings the entire song, and then Miriam and the women sing sort of in a call and response fashion, and they start in, and we get the first couple of verses of the very song that Moses just sang.
Yeah. Why do we have that repetition?
Well,
This is a feminist moment.
it's not a not feminist moment. It's a perfect. I mean, it's perfectly. It's very nice. Miriam appears actually far less often than we think. Is my impression. Miriam appears only twice in the book of Exodus. Here, and then back at the beginning when Moses' sister is walking along the banks of the Nile. She's not even named there. This is Miriam's shining moment in the book of Exodus.
Yeah.
Where she is, described as a prophetess.
Yeah.
Right, which is a serious status. She has a leadership role. But the question is, why does she sing the same song again? I think there's probably some sort of history of composition here where one author had the idea that Moses sang this song, and another author had the idea that Miriam sang actually the same song. And when they were put together, rather than have the song twice, we have Miriam starting it, and we're all supposed to know, it's like a catchphrase, we're supposed to know she kept going.
Yeah. But whoever put it together probably figured it was more important to have Moses do it. But at least, they give Miriam a nod. We'll give them that much.
Nothing wrong.
Let's turn back to chapter 14, where you have the script for Cecil B. DeMille.
Right.
But is this the only story that we've got here?
No.
It's a little confusing, isn't it?
It is. If you try to read through the story as it stands in the text, I think it's actually very difficult to know exactly where the people are in relation to the Egyptians, what Moses is doing, what God is doing, how the waters are moving, when the waters are moving, and exactly where anybody is when anybody dies. And the reason for this, as we've seen elsewhere, is we really have, and here again, a classic passage where two stories have been intertwined, and one of them, that is the priestly account, is exactly what we see in the movie. Moses holding his arm over the water, and the water's splitting, and the Israelites going through, and then the Egyptians following, and the waters coming back together. That is exactly how the priestly author tells this story, and that's the one that we're familiar with.
He wasn't really counting on subtlety on the part of the readers. I mean, he wants you to know it's a miracle.
He does.
You're not going to be in any doubt about it.
And in fact, as we read the priestly writings from the plagues to the sea, this is the continuation. This is the last moment, really, of the plagues. Some of the themes that we saw back in the plagues, that is, Pharaoh's lack of free will, the display of divine power. These are all what's really at stake here in the priestly story. If we think about the very beginning of Exodus 14, right, it has the Israelites are leaving Egypt, and they come to a body of water, and God says to them, hold on, wait here, actually turn around a little bit. Just wait and turn around, which makes no sense. No sense at all. And then it goes on to explain. God says, when Pharaoh sees and hears that you guys have turned around here, he will think that you are lost, right? That you're destined to die in the wilderness. And the idea is he's not going to want to pursue you at that point. He's going to think that the wilderness has, as it says, closed in on you. But I'm going to harden his heart and make him chase you. Well, it's for P, in the same way that Pharaoh didn't want to keep the Israelites around, God made him. So too, God makes Pharaoh pursue the Israelites for the express purpose of leading him into the water, killing him, and thereby demonstrating divine power for the sort of last time.
So you could say, at least in the P account, but maybe also in the J account, that this is like the last of the plagues, or only they're not plagues, they're signs and wonders.
That's right.
And this is the last.
That's right.
And unless you were going to count Mount Sinai as yet another sign and wonder, but at least for getting them out of Egypt, this is the crucial one. This is the one that's going to get them out of reach.
This is the border, right? This is the end.
Now, that's nicely coherent with what you had in the P account of the plagues. What about the J account here? What happens there?
It's a very, very different story, and one that I think we have no idea anybody would have ever considered. But in the J account, the Israelites are taking, they don't turn around, they are taking the shortest route from Egypt to Canaan, which is to say, along the coasts of the Mediterranean, right? They're going straight up on what's called the Way of the Philistines.
The Way of the Philistines, which is a little bit anachronistic because the Philistines aren't going to get there for another 100 years or two or whatever.
In any case, but I love finding those little moments.
Yes.
They're wandering. They're going up the coast of Canaan up the coast of the Mediterranean into Canaan, and the Egyptians are actively pursuing them. And in the middle of the night, God, manifested as a pillar of cloud and fire, comes between the Egyptian camp and the Israelite camp, so that the Egyptians can't overrun the Israelites. And what God does in the middle of the night, while everybody is stopped, is He sends an east wind that pushes the waters of the sea back, creating a false shoreline, right? So where there had been sea, there is now dry land. And when morning comes, the Egyptians pick up their pursuit, following the same route they had been following before, which is to say along the coast. But it's not the coast. And when they get to where it had been water, God freezes their chariot wheels so that they're stuck, releases the waters back to their original position, and the Egyptians, in a sort of last moment of realizing that they're in trouble, say, we should really try and run away. But they can't. And so instead of the waters closing in like this, it's a tidal wave that comes back. And the Israelites, the entire time, have not moved an inch. They don't cross the water. They continue along the coast. And it says at the beginning of the J story, right? Moses says to them, stand still and God will fight for you. And that's exactly what happens.
Yeah, there are actually other stories where you get that motif much later, even in the Book of Chronicles, that this becomes the prescription for how to fight.
That's right.
You know, stand still. Don't try this at home, but if you're in the biblical story, it's the way to do it.
It's the same sort of thing you find in Joshua, right? Where they
they
march
around the
you walk around,
and,
the walls will fall down, and then you'll just walk in and clean up the mess.
But now, in this case, especially as you've just explained it with the tidal wave, I can just imagine people listening to this and saying, that's the way it happened. This gives you a much more reasonable story, you know, that it was a tidal wave.
Right.
And
these things happen.
These things happen. What do you make of that?
It's the same. It's the same conversation that we had about the plagues. In fact, people have this conversation about even the priestly account of the splitting of the sea. Right? They say, well, you know, there are times at certain bodies of water where if the wind blows at a certain strength at a certain time of day on a certain day of the year every 7 years, right? Then it's possible to walk across. You know, these are stories of divine intervention. That's the meaning. In fact, the story ends. The Yahwist story ends with the Israelites seeing the Egyptians dead and realizing God's power.
Yes.
That's the message of the story. If you make it a natural disaster, you've lost that.
Yes, and if you're connecting this with the earlier part of the J story, it looks like Yahweh says, I've given these people chances enough.
That's right.
They didn't let it go, and here they go now.
That's right.
There's one other thing I'd like to mention about this, though. The sea comes up a lot later on in poetic passages. that the way you demonstrate the power of God is his mastery over the sea. And that's an old motif back in the old Canaanite myths that we have from Hugh Garrett. Yam or the sea.
It's Mesopotamian
you know,
also.
Or so before that,
Right, we read about God being, in the Bible, we read God enthroned on the flood, enthroned on the sea.
And the way in which God exercises his mastery is by control of the sea. And you kind of wonder, did some people in the ancient world worry that the sea was just going to overrun the land or overflow the land? But it's a nice poetic metaphor, but it is poetry.
Absolutely.